Yeah, pulled it up.
And just a reminder, if you're not participating in the conversation, if you could mute yourself, since we are recording this presentation.
I also had like more things you would like.
There we go. And today we're going to be focusing on habitats. So far in the series of classes, we've talked about, our first class focused a lot on what are the benefits of nature journaling, what is nature journaling, how do you get started? And as we've gone through the class, we have focused on kind of different groups of species and talking about how we can identify them, drawing them, writing them down, things to look for. And then we've been kind of periodically engaging with our natural environment through the homework activities. And so today we're going to kind of take a step back or up, if you will, and look at a little bit of a bigger picture. So rather than looking at an individual plant, we're going to look at the habitat that surrounds us. And here in Manatee County, we're really lucky. We have a wide diversity of habitats, and Florida actually in of itself has a really wide diversity of habitats. And within those different habitats, we'll find lots of different species, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. And one of the things that is nice about knowing what habitat you're in when you're nature journaling is that you can be better prepared to identify potential plant or animal species that you see, because you'll know kind of what species are generally found in certain areas and what some of the characteristic or keystone species of those environments are as well. So topics for today, just talking about what is a habitat and how do humans impact our idea of habitat. This kind of harkens back to our discussion about nature, right? What is nature? How is the human definition of nature impacted by our emotions, our culture, our surroundings, and thinking about whether or not humans have an impact on the type and availability of habitat. We're going to look at some of the common habitat types in Florida, some species common to those habitats, and then as we've done in the past classes, do a few practice activities. But first, I don't think we have enough people to do breakout rooms today, but we can just go individually and share out our observations from last week's homework, which were to sit underneath a tree and write down some thoughts and observations, and then maybe try to identify the tree under which you are sitting or were sitting. So I'm going to just go ahead and call on somebody. Let's see, Tiffany, if you'd like to participate, do you want to tell us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have the good fortune to live right next to a big banyan tree. So that thing is crazy. There's all kinds of like hidden crevices and lizards and plants that it's almost a habitat unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so it always makes me think of Jurassic Park.
Very nice.
But that was my tree.
Awesome. Yeah, the all the nooks and crannies in banyan trees can be pretty fun to explore. I know I like taking my kids to Ringling and just playing in the outdoor space there. And there's a banyan tree closer to the big mansion down there that has almost entirely enveloped a statue. And so what you see is just like this part of a face kind of peeking out of these banyan roots at you. It's pretty eerie. I encourage you to look for it next time you go there. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. I think during the pandemic, to limit the number of people using the grounds, they changed it to $5 entry to utilize the space there, just to go and like have a picnic or something. It used to be free entry, but I'm not sure if they're planning on changing that anytime soon, but speaking of banyan trees, it's a good place to go observe them. Joanne?
All right, I spend time under a tree in my yard. It's a black sapote. There's looking up in it, it's about 30 feet tall, and it has black sapotes on it ready to get ripe. And I saw all kinds of birds just like that banyan tree. Birds were flying around, lizards, spiders, ants. What else? I wrote everything down. I heard all these birds. I heard the indigo bunting, which is back.
Awesome.
They're back again. And hawks, I heard the wind and I felt the wind. And I thought about the roots of the tree going to, we have a gumbo limbo tree, not near it, but the gumbo limbo's got that mushroom root rot. And so I was thinking, I hope maybe it's feeding it because it's not dying yet, but maybe it will survive and help the other tree too. So I was thinking of everything. It was fun.
Awesome. Great. Shirley, do you want to share? Is Shirley there? We'll come back to you, Shirley, if you don't know how to unmute. You should be able to find a little button that looks like a microphone, and you can click or unclick that. If you're on a mobile device, it might be a round blue button with a microphone in it. So that's all right. We can come back to you. Patsy.
Well, I walked out to my pond. There's an oak tree out there, and I paid some attention to the oak tree to identify it, even though I knew what it was. And I was just so enthralled by all the birds, the water birds around the pond. There was an anhinga. In the background, I could hear mourning doves, a heron flew in and chased off just as the anhinga dove into the water to see if they could get some fish. What else did I see out there? A white egret was there, and it had extremely feathery wings. I was just amazed at that. And then as I looked across the pond, I noticed that some pickerel weed that I had planted a couple of years ago, I thought it was dead, and it's alive and thriving.
Awesome.
So that made my day.
Great, great. All right, Christine. Christine, yeah.
Yes, the unmute doesn't work so fast. I am lucky enough to have a gumbo limbo, and it. I thought about its name, the Taurus tree, and remembering that it's like sunburn and peeling bark, which was kind of rough on my back. And it looks towards the side of my property where I have a false indigo, which is blooming and full of the bees. I mean, hundreds of bees on that shrub tree. Lots of birds because I went out early in the day. Lots of, oddly enough, some crows that were, I don't know if they were protecting something, but they were making a lot of noise. I also thought about the roots, and I kind of believe in the fact that my tree and the other trees all around here, I have an oak tree and some palms, and I just do think they take care of each other.
Very nice. Awesome. Yeah, I didn't specifically sit down and write down, but I did have a really lovely experience looking up at I have a very large oak tree in the middle of my backyard. It's about, I mean, it's probably a good 4-foot diameter, the trunk of it. It's a really big, really old oak tree. And I was sitting on my back porch and I just looked up at it and I thought about all of the different things that I could see living in and on my tree. So like lichen, resurrection fern. I've mounted a couple of orchids up there. There were squirrel nests, there were birds, there were insects, there were lizards. And, in speaking to that idea that, a tree can be a habitat unto itself, there are some trees that are. And you think about the tropical rainforest, they have whole different species that will be in the canopy versus in the mid-range versus at the base of the tree. Some animals, insects, lizards, will spend their entire life cycle in one tree. And so yeah, that is a fascinating concept and a great connection that I hadn't made to today's topic, thinking about habitat. That's a great segue for us into talking about what a habitat is. And a habitat is generally, it's a little bit different than an ecosystem. Ecosystem is something a bit more technical, and it refers not only to the living or organic materials, but also the inorganic and chemical properties and nutrient cycles and things like that of a particular area that all have similar kind of characteristics. But a habitat more specifically speaks to the fact that it's some geographic area, and it could be as small as a single tree. But it's some geographic area that contains some interdependent species, some species that rely on each other, and it supports the life of those species that live within it. So a habitat can be very small or it can be very large, depending on the species that depends upon it. Some animals need a much broader geographic range in order for their habitat to be suitable. Think about things like the Florida black bear. It needs hundreds of square miles in order for it to be able to be successful in its life cycle. If you think about, something like a honeybee, you may think a honeybee only needs a very small space in order to be successful. But honeybees can travel up to 40 miles in one direction, seeking out pollen or seeking out nectar and collecting pollen throughout the course of their day. So some geographic areas are surprisingly large, like in the case of the honeybee, and some seem pretty appropriate, like in the case of the black bear. But basically a habitat, again, it's some kind of delineated geographic area that contains interdependent species that supports the life of those species. So if we think about what a habitat is, I think it's good to think about the difference between a human habitat and kind of a natural habitat. We often refer to habitats when we're talking about nature and animals and birds and things like that. But humans don't live exclusively out in what we consider to be nature anymore, right? We kind of build what we need. We create these encapsulated environments that allow us to live in climates that would be potentially unsuitable for us. I'm sitting in an air-conditioned office right now with artificial lighting and an air purification system and tinted windows to lower the energy consumption. So, I would not be wearing jeans and a long sleeve shirt sitting outside in Florida right now, right? It's 86 degrees today. It's pretty hot. So we as humans have taken it upon ourselves to kind of build our own habitats. And in doing so, we impact the amount of available habitat for other species. And I'm just curious, to hear from you all, how far flung do you think human impact goes? do you think that there are habitats that exist that are not impacted by humans at this point? It's a thinker. How about, how can we see the impact of human development on habitat? What are some examples of the ways we see human impact on habitat?
Deforestation?
Yeah, that would be one. The removal of trees for, you know, resource consumption. Absolutely, deforestation. Yep. That's going to change the available habitat, right? You may go from a wooded environment to something more like a pasture land, right? And that's something that happened here in Florida. We had a huge timber industry, took a lot of pines out of Florida, and a lot of that land has kind of subsequently become, you know, cattle land, ranch land. What about, think about water in Florida.
In a lot of the development infills previous wetlands and so forth, and they supposedly mitigate that by creating wetlands in other areas, but I don't think that it's ever quite as even close to being as good as the original.
So Florida is a really interesting environment from a topographical standpoint, because our underlying bedrock is limestone, so it's very porous. And yes, so as we change the permeability of what's on top of the land, we change how the water flows below the land, and that can change things. Especially, there's some really interesting research looking at ephemeral wetlands. So these are wetlands that are only wet during certain times of the year, and they rely on certain levels of groundwater in order to get to that point. And there's something you should look up, the Flatwoods salamander. It's this really industrious little salamander that actually, it uses these ephemeral wetlands. It'll walk a couple miles, climb up strands of grass, hang over the water, and lay its eggs on these strands of grass in these ephemeral wetlands. And if these wetlands aren't wet, then the salamander can't reproduce. And so as water consumption changes, right, we have an impact there. I have a photo here of the same place that is 40 years apart. This is a glacier in Alaska. And so I have this picture up here because when we think about how far flung is human impact, right? I am incredibly lucky as to have spent 3 amazing summers in Alaska when I was younger. And we think of Alaska as like the, you know, the final frontier of nature, and it's pristine, and but human activity is still impacting areas, even if a human isn't physically touching that area. You know, we have examples of the way our land use and our resource consumption is changing the prevalence of ice mass on the planet. And even thinking about things like, you can take an air sample over the South Pole in Antarctica, and you can find bits of plastic in that air sample. So human impact is very far flung into areas that we may not consider it to be. And I don't want to take away from the conversation of habitat by saying, well, it's all ruined, because it's not ruined, right? Animals and plants and things are able to adapt, but as you go out and you take your observations and you write things down, you know, I think it's important to kind of recognize where we may have had an impact on what we're seeing, and just kind of think like, this is a beautiful tree, and you're sitting and you're thinking under that beautiful tree, would this beautiful tree be here if people weren't here? You know, that's an interesting thing to ponder, especially when we start thinking about things like invasive plants and all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted to kind of open up that conversation a little bit. So we know what a habitat is. We know that humans create kind of their own habitat, and we also know that humans can impact far-flung habitats as well. But what I want to do is talk to you about how we kind of classify habitats, especially here in our particular part of Florida. Florida is it's the southernmost portion of the historic range of the longleaf pine. And since it is part of this longleaf pine area, there are some characteristics of the types of habitats and the types of ecosystems that Florida supports. Two of those types of ecosystems are flatwoods and dry prairie. And so you can see examples of both of these here. Some flatwoods ecosystems, which is on the right-hand side, some flatwoods will be dominated by saw palmetto. So instead of seeing this grassy ground cover and herbs and flowers and things like that, what you would see down here would be saw palmetto. So you'd see a lot of saw palmetto down here at the base of these pine trees. These pine trees are most likely slash pines, but they could be longleaf pines. There are some longleaf stands still remaining. Does anybody know what happened to most of the longleaf pines in Florida?
Weren't they used for lumber?
They were used for lumber. They were also used in the turpentine industry. And so what's interesting is that some of the remaining longleaf pine that you can find will have these kind of V-shaped gouges in the bark, and these are called cat faces. And they used to cut into the bark and put a little clay pot in there to collect the sap from the longleaf pine trees, and then they would boil it down and get the turpentine out of it. And so longleaf pine trees were harvested for timber, and they were also used in the turpentine industry. And Sarasota and Manatee counties both had logging towns. We had lumber companies that set up little logging towns. People lived there. They harvested the timber. They harvested the turpentine. There's some really interesting history about our pine trees here in this area. So they may be longleaf, they may be slash pine, but you'll see these tall pine trees, and there will often be in our area, especially, a lot of saw palmetto that kind of dominates the understory. Now, the key component and why these two habitat types, excuse me, why these two habitat types are kind of lumped together is that they're both dependent upon fire as a disturbance mechanism. So the flatwoods and the dry prairie that you see here have plant species that have evolved to require the presence of fire in order to have successful germination or flowering or some sort of portion of their reproductive process. Pine trees, they need to shed some of these lower branches in order to make them more competitive. Fire comes along, removes some of those lower branches. They naturally kill off some of those lower branches as well. The fire comes through and reduces the the competition between the pine trees and the other plants, the maybe shrubby kind of understory trees that may come in and shade out some of these other things. The seeds, the seed pods will only open up if there is fire present. A lot of the species that live in these areas will do that. Certain types of grass species that live in these dry prairies will only produce seed if they're burned during the growing season. So they really are dependent upon fire. And so something that I like to talk about when we're talking about these habitats and kind of the preservation of good habitat in Florida is that due to kind of the pace of human development and the way we have interspersed ourselves among all of these connected habitats, is that now a lot of this fire management has to come from the land management agencies or from the ranchers, whoever owns the property. And so there's a lot of burning that's done, and it's good. And there's definitely some misconceptions out there about whether burning is good. And from an ecological perspective, it's a necessary component of these habitat types. There are other kinds of habitats that get lumped in with the longleaf kind of definition, but they're not as common here in our area. If you want to see a really great example of some dry prairie, Myakka River State Park has some really good dry prairie that you can go out. I definitely recommend going in the kind of like November through now time frame to go see some of the, you get kind of the autumn species that are blooming, and then you also get some of the spring blooming, which is really nice. And you know, there are a lot of different kinds of birds that are associated with these prairie ecosystems. You think about things like the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is a critically endangered species. It relies on this dry prairie ecosystem in order to survive. They have a population of them out at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, and they work to manage them and maintain that population there. I'm sure most of you have seen something that looks like flatwoods. This is going to be the most prevalent kind of habitat type that's going to dominate our uplands. So any place where it's a little bit drier and it's a little bit higher elevation in our area, you're generally going to have some type of flatwoods environment. We also get mixed hardwood forests. You can see we've got here sweet gum tree, lots of understory trees. These are going to might have some maple there as well. I think this one right here is probably an Acer rubrum or an Acer saccharum. And so these areas tend to, these habitat types are found in areas kind of maybe in a floodplain, so close to a river. There's a really great example of this type of habitat. If you go to Little Manatee River State Park, they have the North Trail that's along the river, and it's a really good trail through some of this mixed hardwood habitat. And you know, if you think about what would you find in a mixed hardwood, you're going to have more shade at the ground level, so there's going to be fewer grasses and wildflowers. You're going to have species that depend upon trees, so things like squirrels. Lots of different birds are going to live here. Especially you'll find things like hollies in these mixed hardwood environments, and so those trees provide a lot of forage for birds, and so you tend to find a lot more birds in these habitats. And things like raccoons, things that like to live in trees, you're going to find them in these mixed hardwood habitats. These are going to be some of the best places to find mushrooms. If you're going out specifically looking to find or ID mushrooms, these mixed hardwood forests, they tend to have the decomposing organic matter that mushrooms like to live on. And so this can be a good place if you're going out for a mushroom hike. You can look for something that is a mixed hardwood forest. Sometimes these mixed hardwood forests will be at the edges of wetlands and will be periodically flooded. You can see in this picture, there's actually a boardwalk here. And that means that this is probably in a floodplain or an area that is periodically flooded and is adjacent to a wetland. And that's pretty common in our area. Then we get into our true wetlands. And what's interesting about Manatee County, we actually don't have historically occurring cypress here in Manatee County. The cypress trees that you see here in this image, we really don't have cypress dominated wetlands in Manatee County. We have some cypress wetlands at Myakka River State Park and in a couple other preserves, but to our best information and kind of history of those sites, that cypress was planted there. And so that's kind of an interesting tidbit. You find them again naturally occurring up in Hillsborough County, so I don't know why you wouldn't have them down here, but they just tended to not really grow here in Manatee County. Could have something to do with our soils. You know, Hillsborough has some more natural spring formations, and Manatee County tends to be much more covered in sand. We don't have limestone as close to the surface. We are much sandier for our soil here. And so that may be one of the reasons why we don't have quite so much or have any kind of historically documented cypress in our area. Wetlands are going to be those environments that are dominated by either consistently or periodically wet soils. And the plants that live in those environments have some kind of specialized modifications to them that allow them to continue to grow even in cases where the soil is completely inundated with water. Plants must exchange oxygen and gases. Their roots have to be able to do that. So there needs to be oxygen in the soil. But if soil is full of water, there's no oxygen there. So plants have to sometimes come up with special adaptations. And so you'll find within wetlands, you're going to have plants that are adapted to that low oxygen environment. You're going to find a lot of muck soils here. So soils that are going to be kind of smelly. And they're smelly because things are breaking down in the absence of oxygen. And when things decompose in the absence of oxygen, they tend to produce a lot of sulfur compounds, and sulfur smells like rotten eggs. So these wetlands tend to be a little bit stinky as far as the soils are concerned. You will tend to find a lot of really amazing epiphytes in these areas. And so epiphytes are things like orchids and bromeliads that live on trees. They don't have to be rooted in the soil. You're going to find aquatic species here or species that need water in order to reproduce. So think about things like amphibians, turtles, a lot of snakes like to live in wetlands. And I think this is probably why people have kind of a historical aversion to wetlands. For whatever reason, we tend to not like frogs and snakes, and they're kind of smelly. So. But I have to say that some of the most amazing observations that I've made in Florida have been in wetlands. And don't be too afraid of the alligators. You know, I've gone on hikes where the whole time I was walking through water that I couldn't see through, that was up to my waist. And it's fine. You just, you know, they're not. I mean, I wouldn't take my 2-year-old on a hike like that, but I felt plenty safe, especially with a walking stick. But again, wetlands are going to have a lot of really amazing epiphytes when you really stop to look at the trees that are there. Things like ferns, other kinds of species that need water in order to facilitate their reproduction. So you will find mushrooms as well growing here, because the spores, right, need water in order to start to I'm going to blank on the word right now. It's not germinate when it's a mushroom, but it's basically the same thing. But they need that water in order to functionally reproduce. So you'll find mushrooms here. In our area, you may find, since we are not dominated by cypress, you may find some oak trees in these areas, but you'll often find things like pop ash, and I think that's Fraxinus virginiana. But pop ash is one of the trees that will dominate in these inundated environments. And then things like sugar maple and sweet gum, they also like to be near wet. So you'll find some of those things as well. You'll also find lots of wading birds in wetlands, right? Because it's a great hunting ground for them. One of the, I think we have two more types of habitats, and then we're going to have an activity. The dune or beach habitat. This is a really interesting habitat because it is one of the harshest environments that a species can live in Florida. These plant and animal species that specialize in this type of habitat, that live in these habitats, are adapted to incredibly low nutrient environment. I mean, these plants are growing in straight sugar sand, right? There's very, very little organic matter to be found in this soil, if you can even call it that. And these plants will have these incredibly robust root systems of rhizomes and stolons that really help to hold all of that soil in the face of wind and wave action. So these plants have to be able to withstand high salt environments, high wind environments. And then the animal species that live in these areas, there are things like the Florida beach mouse, gopher tortoises live in these areas, lots of shorebirds, ghost crabs. I love this ecosystem. It doesn't have as high of a diversity as some of the other habitats we've talked about in terms of number of species that you find there, as aside from the marine species. But as far as kind of plants and animals, it's fairly limited, but they're just so resilient that you have to really admire them. There's a fabulous book that I'm gonna not remember the name of it right now, but it's written by Rachel Carson. And before she wrote Silent Spring, she was just a biologist that wrote books about nature. And she has a really fabulous book. Maybe it's called Journeys Along the Southeast Coastal Plain. I'll have to look it up and I'll share the link. But she just writes about kind of the southeast of the United States and salt flats and these sandy coastal environments. And it really changed my perspective of where I was living, because I fell in love with the rocky coasts of the West Coast, all those tide pools and all the stuff that you can find out there. But there's a lot to be seen here in Florida. Especially in our dune habitats. And then one of my favorite habitat types here in Florida is the estuary system. The estuary is an area that is a mix of fresh and salt water. So it's going to be a brackish, aquatic environment. If it's dominated by a plant species, that plant is going to be a mangrove. And this is a photo that I took. I took this photo out at Emerson Point Preserve. I was just on a hike with my daughter and my son, and mangroves are incredible species. I do classes just on mangroves. We have 3 species here in Florida. There are over 70 species worldwide. But you can see here the way that they grow. This is a red mangrove. They're just amazing in their growth habit and the patterns that they make. This mangrove is probably 40 years old. They drop down these aerial roots, and you can kind of tell how old they are by looking at how high up in the canopy the aerial roots are dropping from, because they kind of, as they grow up, those aerial roots continue to drop from the same location. So the higher up it is, the older the mangrove is. These red mangroves, they have this horizontal growth pattern. They catch sediments. They do all kinds of neat stuff. You can find 100 different species just living on these mangrove roots. And so in this estuary system, you know, there are lots of really neat marine species, seagrasses, fish, all that kind of stuff that you can see. But if you don't want to actually get in the water, you can just sit next to a mangrove and you can look at all the different crabs and mollusks and lizards and birds and sponges and corals that live on and among the roots of these really incredible trees. And so here in Manatee County, we're pretty much dominated by mangrove estuaries. There are some examples of kind of like black rush or needle rush estuary systems, and that's up kind of near the closer to the freshwater side of the Braden River. So if you go up kind of the Braden River a little ways closer to where it just starts to mix in with the salt environment, you can find some Juncus effusus, some needle rush flats out there, and they have a really interesting environment as well. Okay, so I talked at you enough. Whoa, I talked at you a long time. So bet you can't tell that my undergraduate degree is in environmental science and my master's degree is in ecology. We could talk about this stuff for a long time. I'm gonna go ahead and put a Jamboard link in the chat right here. And if you would go to the Jamboard, and this first slide on the Jamboard, the first page, just draw an arrow to the habitat that coincides. You'll see a picture of a habitat and a bubble with the name of a habitat. Just go ahead and draw an arrow. And we'll take 2 minutes. And what we're doing is we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at those pictures that are there in the Jamboard. And you don't have to write anything on it, but just place a sticky note underneath which of those animals you think belongs in the habitat that's identified at the top of the Jamboard. So if you're looking for the Jamboard link, it's in the chat box. I'm going to go there and just see how people are doing. Good. That is a black racer. And there are a few good. Okay. All right, I'll give us about, another minute or so. Got a bit of time. All right. Looks good. Is anybody familiar on the folks that are on the 5th page? The lizard on the left is one of my favorite lizards, hands down. It's a 5-lined skink. Talk about charismatic. You can't see that blue tail and not go, whoa, what's that? All right. I'll have to see if I can recover. I don't think there's any way to undo that on that first slide. That's all right. On the second slide, we've got some good selections here. The first animal pictured is a river otter. So it would be found in a river, not in a wetland. The second picture is a gopher tortoise. Gopher tortoises like dry areas, uplands. And black racers, you find them everywhere. So yes, you would find it in a wetland. And then the great blue heron absolutely would be in a wetland. And then animals that might live in dunes. Here you have Florida beach mouse, an osprey. You would find it hunting in and around the dunes for sure. And yes, you can find gopher tortoises. They really like to live on the backside of the dunes, closer to the uplands, further away from the beach. But yeah, they like to live in those areas. Estuary, yep, very good. Manatees, alligators, snook. You would find all of those things in an estuary. Alligators are not going to be very far down in the kind of as far as into the salty portion of the estuary. They would be further up in more of the freshwater portion of the estuary, but they do occasionally get washed out during storms. So you can find alligators there as well. And then we've got our 5-lined skink, our woodpecker, and our red-shouldered hawk. Those are all animals that would live in a hardwood forest. The red-shouldered hawk would probably occupy kind of the edge of the hardwood forest because they really like hunting in areas where they have a little bit more of a view. But you would also find things like owls in a hardwood forest. These skinks really like to live, like you can tip over a rotten log and you'll see them scurry out from underneath the rotten log. So that's a pretty common place to find them as well. So, all right. Great job, everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and share the last slide for today. Oh, but of course it's going to take forever. Here, we don't need to do that. You can see it well enough here. So next week we are going to be doing to celebrate National Poetry Month, we're going to be looking specifically about nature-related poetry and talking about how it's kind of connected with nature journaling. I want to kind of review everything that we've talked about, bring it all together, think about how we're going to move forward with our nature journal since we know a little bit more about these species and these habitats. And I hope that as we've gone through this class, you're kind of learning what sort of things you're more interested in and maybe things that you'd like to, or techniques that you like to use for writing things down, for documenting what you see. I really like poetry, and I think that it can be a really, it doesn't like me today. I'm just going to stop my share because don't need it. I just like to look at that picture of that iris. It's such a pretty picture. So in order to help us celebrate National Poetry Month, I would like it if you would please find 2 poems about nature that you would like to share with the group for next week. And along with that, if you want to write down how those poems make you feel, or areas that you can think of that you've been, that those poems remind you of, any of those kind of thoughts associated with that poetry, I think that would be a really nice addition to the conversation that we'll have next week. So again, just try to find 2 poems about nature and we'll be ready to share them. And I will have some things to share with you as well. And we'll do a review. And then that will be the conclusion of our 6-week nature journaling class. Can you believe that it's been this long? And I'll be sprucing up the videos again after we finish next week and getting them up on YouTube. So if you have friends that are interested, if you want to review the material, it'll be available and you can share the link with your pals. I hope you do. So thank you all for today, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.